Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. There Shall Be No Darkness by James Blish. Horror. James Blish has very rarely deviated from science fiction in his imaginative stories, and to the best of my knowledge, where he has essayed into fantasy, it has been science-directed fantasy, with the exception of Black Easter or Faust Alephnel. The present story is not an exception. The werewolf we meet here is no supernatural manifestation but a plausibly explained creature. Either the science fiction nor the horror element is slighted, so that we feel that this story was rightly published in Thrilling Wonder Stories and it has equal validity here. Blish was seen in the letter department of Astounding Stories in 1932, and tried his hand at fan magazine publishing later in the 30s. His first published story was in the initial issue of Frederik Pohl's Super Science Stories in 1940, and his first science fiction novel, Let the Finder Beware, appeared in the December 1949 issue of Thrilling Wonder Stories. Expanded, it became his first hardcover book, Jack of Eagles, soon to be reissued in soft covers. His theological science fiction novel, A Case of Conscience, won a Hugo in 1959. But the book which gives him the most satisfaction, to date, is not science fiction and has never been published in this country. Dr. Mirabilis, a novel about Roger Bacon and the founding of the scientific method, was published by Faber and Faber in England, where it became both a critical and commercial success. It was about 10 p.m. when Paul Foote decided that there was a monster at Nookliff's house party. Foote was tight at the time, tighter than he liked to be ever. He sprawled in a tweezy chair in the front room on the end of his spine, his arms resting on the high arms of the chair. A half-empty glass depended laxly from his right hand. A darker spot on one gray trouser leg showed where some of the drink had gone. Through half-shut eyes he watched Jarmuskowski at the piano. The pianist was playing, finally, the Scriabin Sonata for which the rest of the gathering had been waiting, but for Foote, who was a painter with a tin ear, it wasn't music at all. It was a cantrap, whose implications were secret and horrible. The room was stuffy, and was only half as large as it had been during the afternoon, and Foote was afraid that he was the only living man in it except for Jan Jarmuskowski. The rest were wax figures, pretending to be humans in an aesthetic trance. Of Jarmuskowski's vitality there could be no question. He was not handsome, but there was in him a pure brute force that had its own beauty, that and the beauty of precision with which the force was controlled. When his big hairy hands came down it seemed that the piano should fall into flinders. But the impact of fingers on keys was calculated to the single dying. It was odd to see such delicacy behind such a face. Jarmuskowski's hair grew too low on his rounded head despite the fact that he had avoided carefully any suggestion of musician's haircut. His brows were straight, rectangular, so shaggy that they seemed to meet. From where Foote sat he noticed for the first time the odd way the Pole's ears were placed, tilted forward as if in animal attention, so that the vestigial point really was in the uppermost position. They were cocked directly toward the keyboard, reminding Foote irresistibly of the dog on his master's voice trademark. Where had he seen that head before? In Matthias Grunwald, perhaps, in that panel on the Isenheim altar that showed the Temptation of Saint Anthony. Or was it one of the illustrations in the Red Grimoire, those odd old woodcuts that Chris Lundgren called Rorschach tests of the medieval mind? Jarmuskowski finished the Scriabin, paused, touched his hands together reflectively, began a work of his own, the Killiard fantasy lie. The wax figures did not stir, but a soft eerie sigh of recognition came from their frozen lips. There was another person in the room, but Foote could not tell who it was. When he turned his unfocused eyes to count, his mind went back on him, and he never managed to reach a total. But somehow there was the impression of another presence that had not been of the party before. Jarmuskowski was not the presence. He had been there before. But he had something to do with it. There was an eighth presence now, and it had something to do with Jarmuskowski. What was it? For it was there was no doubt about that. The energy which the rest of Foot's senses ordinarily would have consumed was flowing into his instincts now because his senses were numbed. Acutely, poignantly, his instincts told him of the monster. It hovered around the piano, sat next to Jarmuskowski as he caressed the musical beast's teeth, blended with the long body and the serpentine fingers. Foot had never had the horrors from drinking before, and he knew he did not have them now. A part of his mind which was not drunk had recognized real horror somewhere in this room. And the whole of his mind, its skeptical barriers down, believed and trembled within itself. The bad-eyed circling of the frantic notes was stilled abruptly. Foot blinked, startled. "Already?" he said stupidly. "Already?" Jarmuskowski echoed. "But that's a long piece, Paul. Your fascination speaks well from my writing." His eyes flashed redly as he looked directly at the painter. Foot tried frantically to remember whether or not his eyes had been red during the afternoon, or whether it was possible for any man's eyes to be as red at any time as this man's were now. "The writing?" he said, condensing the far-flung diffusion of his brain. Nookliff's highballs were damned strong. "Hardly the writing, January. Such fingers as those could put fascination into 3 blind mice." He laughed inside at the parade of emotions which marched across Jarmuskowski's face. Startlement at a compliment from Foot, for there had been an inexplicable antagonism between the two since the pianist had first arrived, then puzzled reflection, then finally veiled anger as the hidden slur bared its fangs in his mind. Nevertheless, the man could laugh at it. "They are long, aren't they?" he said to the rest of the group, unrolling them like the party noisemakers which turn from snail to snake when blown through. "But it's a mistake to suppose that they assist my playing, I assure you. Mostly they stumble over each other. Especially over this one." He held up his hands for inspection. Suddenly Foot was trembling. On both hands, the index fingers and the middle fingers were exactly the same length. "One supposed Lundgren would call me a mutation. It's a nuisance at the piano." Doris Gilmore, once a student of Jarmuskowski in Prague, and still obviously, painfully, in love with him, shook coppery hair back from her shoulders and held up her own hands. "My fingers are so stubby," she said ruefully. "Hardly pianist's hands at all." "The hands of a master pianist," Jarmuskowski said. He smiled, scratching his palms abstractedly, and Foot found himself in a universe of brilliant, perfectly even teeth. No, not perfectly even. The polished rows were bounded almost mathematically by slightly longer cuspids. They reminded him of that idiotic Poe story, was it Berenice? Obviously Jarmuskowski would not die a natural death. He would be killed by a dentist for possession of those teeth. 3/4 of the greatest pianists I know have hands like truck drivers, Jarmuskowski was saying. Surgeons too, as Lundgren will tell you. Long fingers tend to be clumsy. You seem to manage to make tremendous music, all the same, Nookliff said, getting up. Thank you, Tom. Jarmuskowski seemed to take his host's rising as a signal that he was not going to be required to play any more. He lifted his feet from the pedals and swung them around to the end of the bench. Several of the others rose also. Foot struggled up to numb feet from the infernal depths of the armchair. He set his glass cautiously on the side table and picked his way over to Christian Lundgren. I read your paper, the one you read to the Stockholm Congress, he said, controlling his tongue with difficulty. Jarmuskowski's hands are. Yes, the psychiatrist said, looking at Cook with sharp, troubled eyes. Suddenly Foot was aware of Lundgren's chain of thought. The gray, chubby little man was assessing his drunkenness, and wondering whether or not Foot would have forgotten the whole business in the morning. Lundgren made a gesture of dismissal. I saw them, he said, his tone flat. A mutation probably, as he himself suggests. This is the 20th century. I'm going to bed and forget it. Which you may take for advice Acevel as information. He stalked out of the room, leaving Foote standing alone, wondering whether to be reassured or more alarmed than before. Lundgren should know. Still, if Jarmuskowski was what he seemed, the party appeared to be surviving quite nicely without Foote. Conversations were starting up about the big room. Jarmuskowski and Doris shared the piano bench and were talking in low tones, punctuated now and then by brilliant arpeggios as the Pole showed her easier ways of handling the work she had played before dinner. James and Bennington, the American critic, were dissecting James' most recent novel for a fascinated Nookliff. Blandly innocent Caroline Nookliff was talking to the air about nothing at all. Nobody missed Lundgren, and it seemed unlikely that Foote would be missed. He walked with wobbly nonchalance into the dining room, where the brewer was still clearing the table. "'Excuse me," he said. "Lit the experiment. Return in the morning?" He snatched a knife from the table, looked for the door which led from the dining room into the foyer, propelled himself through it. The hallway was dim but intelligible. As he closed the door to his room, he paused for a moment to listen to Jarmuskowski's technical exhibition on the keys. It might be that at midnight Jarmuskowski would give another sort of exhibition. If he did, Foote would be glad to have the knife. He shrugged uneasily, closed the door all the way and walked over to his bedroom window. At 11:30, Jarmuskowski stood alone on the terrace of Nookliff's country house. Although there was no wind, the night was frozen with a piercing cold, but he did not seem to notice it. He stood motionless, like a black statue, with only the long streamers of his breathing, like twin jets of steam from the nostrils of a dragon, to show that he was alive. Through the haze of lace that curtained Foote's window, Jarmuskowski was an heroic pillar of black stone, but a pillar above a fumarole. The front of the house was entirely dark and the moonlight gleamed dully on the snow. In the dim light, the heavy tower which was the central structure was like some ancient dungeon keep. Thin slits of embrasures watched the landscape with a dark vacuity, and each of the crowning merlins wore a helmet of snow. The house huddled against the malice of the white night. A sense of age invested it. The curtains smelt of dust and antiquity. It seemed impossible that anyone but Foote and Jarmuskowski could be alive in it. After a long moment, Foote moved the curtain very slightly and drew it back. His lace was drenched in moonlight, and he drew back into the dark again, leaving the curtains parted. Jarmuskowski saw the furtive motion. He gave no sign. He remained engrossed in the absurd beauty of the night. Almost the whole of Nookliff's estate was visible from where he stood. Even the black border of the forest, beyond the golf course to the right, could be seen through the dry, frigid air. A few isolated trees stood nearer the house, casting grotesque shadows on the snow, shadows that flowed and changed shape with infinite slowness as the moon moved. Jarmuskowski sighed and scratched his left palm. His lips moved soundlessly. A wandering cloud floated idly toward the moon, its shadow preceding it, gliding in a rush of darkness toward the house. The gentle ripples of the snowbanks contorted in the vast umbra, assumed demon shapes, twisted bodies halt rising from the earth, sinking back, rising again, whirling closer. A damp frigid wind rose briefly, whipping crystalline showers of snow from the terrace flagstones. The wind died as the shadow engulfed the house. For a long instant the darkness and silence persisted. Then, from somewhere among the stables behind the house, a dog raised his voice in a faint, sustained, throbbing howl. Others joined him. Jarmuskowski's teeth gleamed dimly in the occluded moonlight. He stood a moment longer, then his head turned with startling quickness, and his eyes flashed a feral scarlet at the dark window where Foote hovered. Foote released the curtains hastily. Even through them he could see the pianist's grim phosphorescent smile. Jarmuskowski went back into the house. There was a single small light burning in the corridor. Jarmuskowski's room was at the end of the hall next to Foot's. As he walked reflectively toward it, the door of the room across from Foot's swung open and Doris Gilmore came out, clad in a houseboat, a towel over her arm and a toothbrush in her hand. "Oh," she said. Jarmuskowski turned toward her. Foot slipped behind his back and into Jarmuskowski's room. He did not propose to have Doris a witness to the thing he expected from Jarmuskowski. In a quieter voice, Doris said, "Oh, it's you, January. You startled me." "So I see," Jarmuskowski's voice said. Foot canted one eye around the edge of the door. "It appears that we are the night owls of the party. The rest are tight. Especially that horrible painter. I've been reading the magazines Tom left by my bed and I finally decided to go to sleep too." "What have you been doing?" "Oh, I was just out on the terrace, getting a breath of air. I like the winter night, it bites. The dogs are restless too," she said. "Did you hear them?" "Yes," Jarmuskowski said and smiled. "Why does a full moon make a dog feel so sorry for himself?" "Maybe there's a banshee about." "I doubt it," Jarmuskowski said. "This house isn't old enough to have any family psychopomps. As far as I know, none of Tom's or Caroline's relatives have had the privilege of dying in it." "You talk as if you almost believed it." There was a shiver in her voice. She wrapped the houseboat more tightly about her slim waist. "I come from a country where belief in such things is common. In Poland, most of the skeptics are imported." "I wish you'd pretend to be an exception," she said. "You give me the creeps." He nodded seriously. They looked at each other. Then he stepped forward and took her hands in his. Foot felt a belated flicker of embarrassment. If he were wrong, he'd speedily find himself in a position for which no apology would be possible. The girl was looking up at Jarmuskowski, smiling uncertainly. "Jan," she said. "No," Jarmuskowski said. "Wait. It has been a long time since Prague." "I see," she said. She tried to release her hands. Jarmuskowski said sharply, "You don't see. I was 18 then. You were, what was it, 11, I think. In those days I was proud of your schoolgirl crush, but of course infinitely too old for you. I am not so old anymore, and you are so lovely. No, hear me out, please. Doris, I love you now, as I can see you love me, but—" In the brief pause, Foot could hear the sharp indrawn breaths that Doris Gilmore was trying to control. He writhed with shame for himself. He had no business being. "But we must wait, Doris, until I warn you of something neither of us could have dreamed in the old days." "Warn me?" "Yes." Jarmuskowski paused again. Then he said, "You will find it hard to believe. But if you do, we may yet be happy. Doris, I cannot be a skeptic. I am—" He stopped. He had looked down abstractedly at her hands as if searching for precisely the right words. Then, slowly, he turned her hands over until they rested palms up upon his. An expression of inexpressible shock crossed his face, and Foot saw his grip tighten spasmodically. In that silent moment, Foot knew that he had been right about Jarmuskowski, and despite his pleasure he was frightened. For an instant Jarmuskowski shut his eyes. The muscles along his jaw stood out with the violence with which he was clenching his teeth. Then, deliberately, he folded Doris' hands together, and his curious fingers made a fist about them. When his eyes opened again, they were red as flame in the weak light. Doris jerked her hands free and crossed them over her breasts. "Jan, what is it? What's the matter?" His face, that should have been flying into flinders under the force of the thing behind it, came under control muscle by muscle. "Nothing," he said. "There's really no point in what I was going to say. Nice to have seen you again, Doris. Good night." He brushed past her, walked the rest of the way down the corridor, wrenched back the doorknob of his own room. Foot barely managed to get out of his way. Behind the house a dog howled and was silent again. In Jarmuskowski's room the moonlight played in through the open window upon a carefully turned-down bed, and the cold air had penetrated every cranny. He shut the door and went directly across the room to the table beside his bed. As he crossed the path of silvery light his shadow was oddly foreshortened, so that it looked as if it were walking on all fours. There was a lamp on the side table, and he reached for it. Then he stopped dead still, his hand halfway to the switch. He seemed to be listening. Finally, he turned and looked back across the room, directly at the spot behind the door where Foot was standing. It was the blackest spot of all, for it had its back to the moon. But Jarmuskowski said immediately, "Hello, Paul. Aren't you up rather late?" Foot did not reply for a while. His senses were still a little alcohol-numbed, and he was overwhelmed by the thing he knew to be. He stood silently in the darkness, watching the Pole's barely visible figure beside the fresh bed, and the sound of his own breathing was loud in his ears. The broad, flat streamer of moonlight lay between them like a metallic river. "I'm going to bed shortly," he said at last. His voice sounded flat and dead and far away, as if belonging to someone else entirely. "I just came to issue a little warning." "Well, well," said Jarmuskowski pleasantly. "Warnings seem to be all the vogue this evening. Do you customarily pay your social calls with a knife in your hand?" "That's the warning, Jarmuskowski. The knife is a sear knife." "You must be drunker than ever," said the pianist. "Why don't you just go to bed? We can talk about it in the morning." "Don't give me that," Foot snapped savagely. "You can't fool me. I know you for what you are." "All right. I'll bite, as Bennington would say." "Yes, you'd bite," Foot said, and his voice shook a little despite himself. "Shall I give it a name, Jarmuskowski? In Poland they called you Vrolok, didn't they? And in France it was Lugaru. In the Carpathians it was Strigoica or Striga or Vkoslak. Your command of languages is greater than your common sense. But you interest me strangely. Isn't it a little out of season for such things? The aconites do not bloom in the dead of winter. And perhaps the thing you call so many fluent names is also out of the season in 1962. The dogs hate you, Foot said softly. That was a fine display Brucey put on when Tom brought him in from his run and he found you here. Walked sidewise through the room, growling, watching you with every step until Tom dragged him out. He's howling now. And that shock you got from the table silver at dinner, I heard your excuse about rubber-soled shoes. I looked under the table, if you recall, and your shoes turned out to be leather-soled. But was a pretty feeble excuse anyhow, for anybody knows that you can't get an electric shock from an ungrounded piece of tableware, no matter how long you've been scuffing rubber. It was the silver that hurt you the first time you touched it. Silver's deadly, isn't it? And those fingers, the index fingers as long as the middle ones, you were clever about those. You were careful to call everybody's attention to them. It's supposed to be the obvious that everybody misses. But, Jarmuskowski, that purloined letter gag has been worked too often in detective stories. It didn't fool Lundgren and it didn't fool me. Ah, Jarmuskowski said. Cue you to catalog. There's more. How does it happen that your eyes were gray all afternoon and turned red as soon as the moon rose? And the palms of your hands, there was some hair growing there, but you shaved it off, didn't you, Jarmuskowski? I've been watching you scratch them. Everything about you, the way you look, the way you act, everything you say screams your nature in a dozen languages to anyone who knows the signs. After a long silence, Jarmuskowski said, I see. You've been most attentive, Paul, I see you are what people call the suspicious drunk. But I appreciate your warning, Paul. Let us suppose that what you say of me is true. Have you thought that, knowing that you know, I would have no choice any more? That the first word you said to me about it all might brand your palm with the pentagram? Foote had not thought about it. He had spent too much time trying to convince himself that it was all a pipe dream. A shock of blinding terror convulsed him. The silver knife clattered to the floor. He snatched up his hands and stared frantically at them, straining his eyes through the blackness. The full horror implicit in Jarmuskowski's suggestion struck him all at once with paralyzing force. From the other side of his moonlit room, Jarmuskowski's voice came mockingly. So you hadn't thought. Better never than late, Paul! The dim figure of Jarmuskowski began to writhe and ripple in the reflected moonlight. It foreshortened, twisting obscenely, sinking toward the floor, flesh and clothing alike changing into something not yet describable. A cry ripped from Foote's throat, and he willed his legs to move with frantic, nightmarish urgency. His clutching hand grasped the doorknob. Tearing his eyes from the hypnotic fascination of the thing that was going on across from him, he leaped from his corner and out into the corridor. A bare second after he had slammed the door, something struck it a frightful blow from the inside. The paneling split. He held it shut with all the strength in his body. A dim white shape drifted down upon him through the dark corridor, and a fresh spasm of fear sent rivers of sweat down on his back, his sides, into his eyes. But it was only the girl. Paul! What on earth? What's the matter? Quick! He choked out. Get something silver, something heavy made out of silver, quick, quick! Despite her astonishment, the frantic urgency in his voice was enough. She darted back into her room. To Foote it seemed eternity before she returned, an eternity while he listened with abnormally sensitized ears for a sound inside the room. Once he thought he heard a low growl, but he was not sure. The sea-like hissing and sighing of his blood, rushing through the channels of the inner ear, seemed very loud to him. He couldn't imagine why it was not arousing the whole countryside. He clung to the doorknob and panted. Then the girl was back, bearing a silver candlestick nearly 3 feet in length. A weapon that was almost too good, for this fright-weakened muscles had some difficulty in lifting it. He shifted his grip on the knob to his left hand, hefted the candlestick awkwardly. All right, he said, in what he hoped was a grim voice. Now let him come. What in heaven's name is this all about? Doris said. You're waking everybody in the house with this racket. Look, even one of the dogs is in to see. The dog! He swung around, releasing the doorknob. Not 10 paces from them, an enormous coal-black animal, nearly 5 feet in length, grinned at them with polished fangs. As soon as it saw Foote move, it snarled. Its eyes gleamed red in the single bulb. It sprang. Foote lifted the candlestick high and brought it down, but the animal was not there. Somehow the leap was never completed. There was a brief flash of movement at the open end of the corridor, then darkness and silence. He saw the candlestick. Foote panted. Must have jumped out the window and come around through the front door. Saw the silver and beat it. Paul! Doris cried. What? How did you know that thing would jump? It was so big. Silver. He chuckled, surprising even himself. He had a mental picture of what the truth would sound like to Doris. That, he said, was a wolf, and a whopping one. Even the usual kind of wolf isn't very friendly and dash. Footsteps sounded on the floor above, and the voice of Nooklift, grumbling loudly, came down the stairs. Nooklift liked his evenings noisy and his nights quiet. The whole house seemed to have heard the commotion, for in a moment a number of half-clad figures were elbowing out into the corridor, wanting to know what was up. Abruptly the lights went on, revealing blinking faces and pajama-clad forms struggling into robes. Nookliff came down the stairs. Caroline was with him, impeccable even in disarray, her face openly and honestly ignorant and unashamedly beautiful. She made an excellent foil for Tom. She was no lion hunter, but she loved parties. Evidently she was pleased that the party was starting again. "What's all this?" Nookliff demanded in a gravelly voice. "Foot, are you the center of this whirlpool? Why all the noise?" "Werewolf," said Foot, suddenly very conscious of how meaningless the world would be here. "We've got a werewolf here. And somebody's marked out for him. How else could you put it? Let it stand." There was a chorus of "What?" as the group jostled about him. "Eh? What was that?" "Werewolf, I thought he said." "What's this all about?" "Somebody's been a wolf." "Is that new? What an uproar!" "Paul," Lundgren's voice cut through. "Details, please." "Jarmuskowski's a werewolf," Foot said grimly, making his tone as emotionless and factual as he could. "I suspected it earlier tonight, and went into his room and accused him of it. He changed shape, right on the spot while I was watching." The sweat started out afresh at the recollection of that horrible, half-seen mutation. "He came around into the hall and went for us, and I scared him off with a silver candlestick for a club." He realized suddenly that he still held the candlestick, brandished it as proof. "Doris saw the wolf, she'll vouch for that." "I saw a big dog-like thing, all right," Doris admitted. "And it did jump at us. It was black and huge teeth." "But Paul, was that supposed to be Jan?" "Why, that's ridiculous." "It certainly is," Nookliff said feelingly. "Getting us all up for a practical joke. Probably one of the dogs is loose." "Do you have any coal-black dogs 5 feet long?" Foot demanded desperately. "And where's Jarmuskowski now? Why isn't he here? Answer me that!" Bennington gave a skeptical grunt from the background and opened Jarmuskowski's door. The party tried to jam itself into the room. Foot forced his way through the jam. "See? He isn't here either. And the bed's not been slept in. Doris, you saw him go in there. Did you see him come out?" The girl looked startled. "No, but I was in my room, all right. Here. Look at this." Foot led the way over to the window and pointed. "See? The prints on the snow?" One by one the others leaned out. There was no arguing it. A set of animal prints, like large dog tracks, led away from a spot just beneath Jarmuskowski's window, a spot where the disturbed snow indicated the landing of some heavy body. "Follow them around," Foot said. "They lead around to the front door and in." "Have you traced them?" James asked. "I don't have to. I saw the thing, James." "Maybe he went for a walk," Caroline suggested. "Barefoot? There are his shoes." Bennington vaulted over the windowsill with an agility astonishing for so round a man and plowed away with slippered feet along the line of tracks. A little while later he entered the room behind their backs. "Paul's right," he said above the hubbub of excited conversation. "The tracks go around to the front door, then come out again and go away around the side of the house toward the golf course." He rolled up his wet pajama cuffs awkwardly. "This is crazy," Nookliff declared angrily. "This is the 20th century. We're like a lot of little children, panicked by darkness. There's no such thing as a werewolf. I wouldn't place any wagers on that," James said. "Millions of people have thought so for hundreds of years. That's a lot of people." Nookliff turned sharply to Lundgren. "Chris, I can depend upon you at least to have your wits about you." The psychiatrist smiled wanly. "You didn't read my Stockholm paper, did you, Tom? I mean my paper on mental diseases. Most of it dealt with lycanthropy, werewolfism, You mean, you believe this idiot's story? I spotted Jarmuskowski early in the evening, Lundgren said. He must have shaved the hair on his palms, but he has all the other signs: eyes bloodshot with moonrise, first and second fingers of equal length, pointed ears, domed prefrontal bones, elongated upper cuspids or fangs, in short, the typical hyperpineal type, a lycanthrope. Why didn't you say something? I have a natural horror of being laughed at, Lundgren said drily. And Slash didn't want to draw Jarmuskowski's attention to me. These endocrine imbalance cases have a way of making enemies very easily. Foot grinned ruefully. If he had thought of that part of it before accusing Jarmuskowski, he would have kept his big mouth shut. Lycanthropy is quite common, Lundgren droned, but seldom mentioned. It is the little-known aberration of a little-known ductless gland. It appears to enable the victim to control his body. I'm still leery of this whole business, Bennington growled, from somewhere deep in his pigeon's chest. I've known Jan for years. Nice fella, did a lot for me once. And I think there's enough discord in this house so that I won't add to it much if I say I wouldn't trust Paul Foote as far as I could throw him. By heaven, Paul, if this does turn out to be some practical joke of yours. Ask Lundgren, Foote said. There was dead silence, broken only by heavy breathing. Lundgren was known to every one of them as the world's ultimate authority on hormone-created insanity. Nobody seemed to want to ask him. Paul's right, Lundgren said at last. Take it or leave it. Jarmuskowski is a lycanthrope. A hyperpineal. No other gland could affect the blood vessels of the eyes like that or make such a reorganization of the cells possible. Jarmuskowski is inarguably a werewolf. Bennington sagged, the light of righteous incredulity dying from his eyes. I'll be damned, he muttered. We've got to get him tonight, Foote said. He's seen the pentagram on somebody's palm, somebody in the party. What's that? Asked James. Common illusion of lycanthropic seizures, Lundgren said. Hallucination, I should say. A 5-pointed star inscribed in a circle, you find it in all the old mystical books, right back to the so-called 4th and 5th books of Moses. The werewolf sees it on the palm of his next victim. There was a gasping little scream from Doris. So that's it, she cried. Dear God, I'm the one. He saw something on my hand tonight while we were talking in the hall. He was awfully startled and went away without another word. He said he was going to warn me about something and then he... Steady, Bennington said in a soft voice that had all the penetrating power of a thunderclap. There's safety in numbers. We're all here. Nevertheless, he could not keep himself from glancing surreptitiously over his shoulder. Well, that settles it, James said in earnest, squeaky tones. We've got to trail the beast and kill him. It should be easy to follow his V-trail in the snow. We must kill him before he kills Doris or somebody else. Even if he misses us, it would be just as bad to have him roaming the countryside. What are you going to kill him with? Asked Lundgren matter-of-factly. Eh? I said, what are you going to kill him with? With that pineal hormone in his blood, he can laugh at any ordinary bullet. And since there are no chapels dedicated to St. Hubert around here, you can't scare him to death with a church-blessed bullet. Silver will do, Foote said. Yes, silver will do. It poisons the pineal in catalysis. But are you going out to hunt a full-grown wolf, a giant wolf, armed with table silver and candlesticks? Or is somebody here metallurgist enough to cast a decent silver bullet? Foote sighed. With the burden of proof lifted from him, completely sobered up by shock, he felt a little more like his old self, despite the pall of horror which hung over them. Like I always tell my friends, he said, there's never a dull moment at a Nucliffe house party. The clock struck 1:30. Foot picked up one of Nucliffe's rifles and hefted it. It felt useless. He said, "How are you coming?" The group by the kitchen stove shook their heads in comical unison. One of the gas burners had been jury-rigged as a giant Bunsen burner, and they were trying to melt down some soft, unalloyed silver articles, mostly of Mexican manufacture. They were using a small earthenware bowl, also Mexican, for a crucible. It was lidded with the bottom of a flower pot, the hole in which had been plugged with a mixture of garden clay and rock wool yanked forcibly out of the insulation in the attic. The awkward flame leapt uncertainly and sent fantastic shadows flickering over their intent faces. "We've got it melted, all right," Bennington said, lifting the lid cautiously with a pair of kitchen tongs and peering in. "But what do we do now? Drop it from the top of the tower?" "You can't KM a wolf with buckshot," Nucliffe pointed out. Now that the problem had been reduced temporarily from a hypernatural one to ordinary hunting, he was in his element. "And I haven't got a decent shotgun here anyhow. But we ought to be able to whack together a mold. The bullet should be soft enough so that it won't ruin the rifling of my guns." He opened the door to the cellar stairs and disappeared, carrying several ordinary cartridges in one hand. Faintly the dogs renewed their howling and Doris began to tremble. Foot put his arm around her. "It's all right," he said. "We'll get him. You're safe enough." She swallowed. "I know," she agreed in a small voice. "But every time I think of the way he looked at my hands and how red his eyes were, you don't suppose he's prowling around the house? That's what the dogs are howling about." "I don't know," Foot said carefully. "But dogs are funny that way. They can sense things at great distances. I suppose a man with Pinirin in his blood would have a strong odor to them. But he probably knows that we're after his scalp, so he won't be hanging around if he's smart." She managed a tremulous smile. "All right," she said. "I'll try not to be frightened." He gave her an awkward, reassuring pat, feeling a little absurd. "Do you suppose we can use the dogs?" James wanted to know. "Certainly," said Lundgren. "Dogs have always been our greatest allies against the abnormal. You saw what a rage Jarmuskowski's very presence put Brucey in this afternoon. He must have smelled the incipient seizure." Tom, what did you manage?" Nucliffe set a wooden box on the table. "I pried the slug out of one shell for each gun," he said, "and made impressions in clay. The cold has made the stuff pretty hard, so it's a passable mold. Bring the silver over here." Bennington lifted his improvised crucible from the burner, which immediately shot up a tall blue flame. James carefully turned it off. "All right, pour," Nucliffe said. "Lundgren, you don't suppose it might help to chant a blessing or something?" "Not unless Jarmuskowski overheard it. Probably not even then, since we haven't a priest among us." "Okay. Pour, Bennington, before the goo hardens." Bennington decanted sluggishly molten silver into each depression in the clay, and Nucliffe cleaned away the oozy residue from the casts before it had time to thicken. At any other time the whole scene would have been funny, now it was grimly grotesque. Nucliffe picked up the box and carried it back down to the cellar, where the emasculated cartridges awaited their new slugs. "Who's going to carry these things, now?" Foot asked. "There are 5 rifles. James, how about you?" "I couldn't hit an elephant's rump at 3 paces. Tom's an expert shot. So is Bennington here, with a shotgun anyhow." "I can use a rifle," Bennington said diffidently. "I've done some shooting," Foot said. "During the Battle of the Bulge I even hit something." "I," Lundgren said, "am an honorary member of the Swiss militia." Nobody laughed. Most of them were aware that Lundgren in his own obscure way was bragging, that he had something to brag about. Nucliffe appeared abruptly from the cellar. I pried them loose, cooled them with snow, and rolled them out with a file. They're probably badly crystallized, but we needn't let that worry us. He put one cartridge in the chamber of each rifle and shot the bolts home. There's no sense in loading these any more thoroughly. Ordinary bullets are no good anyhow, Chris says. Just make your first shots count. Who's elected? Foote, Lundgren, and Bennington each took a rifle. Nucliffe took the fourth and handed the last one to his wife. I say, wait a minute, James objected. Do you think that's wise, Tom? I mean, taking Caroline along? Why, certainly, Nucliffe said, looking surprised. She shoots like a fiend. She's snatched prizes away from me a couple of times. I thought everybody was going along. That isn't right, Foote said. Especially not Doris, since the wolf that is. I don't think she ought to go. Are you going to leave her here by herself? Oh no, Doris cried. Not here. I've got to go. I don't want to wait all alone in this house. He might come back, and there's nobody here. I couldn't stand it. We're all going, Nucliffe concluded. We can't leave Doris here unprotected, and we need Caroline's marksmanship. Let's get going. It's 2 now. He put on his heavy coat, and with a heavy-eyed Boer, went out to get the dogs. The rest of the company got out their own heavy clothes. Doris and Caroline climbed into ski suits. They assembled one by one in the living room. Lundgren one's eyes swung on a vase of iris-like flowers. Hello, what's this? He said. Monkshood, Caroline informed him. We grow it in the greenhouse. It's pretty, isn't it? Though the gardener says it's poisonous. Chris, Foote said. That isn't woolabane, is it? The psychiatrist shook his head. I'm no botanist. I can't tell one aconite from the other. But it hardly matters. Hyperpineals are allergic to the whole group. The pollen, you see. As in hay lever your hyperpineal breathes the pollen, anaphylaxis sets in. The last twist of the knife, James murmured. A clamoring of dogs outside announced that Nucliffe was ready. With somber faces the party filed out through the front door. For some reason all of them avoided stepping on the wolf's prints in the snow. Their mien was that of condemned prisoners on the way to the tumbrils. Lundgren took one of the sprigs of flowers from the vase. The moon had passed its zenith and was almost halfway down the sky, projecting the Bastille-like shadow of the house before it. But there was still plenty of light, and the house itself was glowing from basement to tower room. Lundgren located Brucey in the milling yapping pack and abruptly thrust the sprig of flowers under his muzzle. The animal sniffed once, then crouched back and snarled softly. Wolfbane, Lundgren said. Dogs didn't react to the other aconites basis of the legend, no doubt. Better fire your gardener, Caroline. In the end he's to blame for all this in the dead of winter. Lycanthropy normally is an autumn affliction, James said. Even a man who says his prayers before he sleeps each night may turn to a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the moon is high and bright. Stop it, you give me the horrors, Foote snapped angrily. Well, the dog knows now, said Nucliffe. Good. It would have been hard for them to pick up the spoor from cold snow, but Brucey can lead them. Let's go. The tracks of the wolf were clear and sharp in the snow. It had formed a hard crust from which fine, powdery showers of tiny ice crystals were whipped by a fitful wind. The tracks led around the side of the house and out across the golf course. The little group plodded grimly along beside them. The spoor was cold for the dogs, but every so often they would pick up a faint trace and go bounding ahead, yanking their master after them. For the most part, however, the party had to depend upon its eyes. A heavy mass of clouds had gathered in the west. The moon dipped lower. Foote's shadow, grotesquely lengthened, marched on before him, and the crusted snow crunched and crackled beneath his feet. There was a watchful, unnaturally still atmosphere to the night, and they all moved in tense silence except for a few subdued growls and barks from the dogs. Once the marks of the werewolf doubled back a short distance, then doubled again as if the monster had turned for a moment to look back at the house before continuing his prowling. For the most part, however, the trail led directly toward the dark boundary of the woods. As the brush began to rise about them, they stopped by mutual consent and peered warily ahead, rifles held ready for instant action. Far out across the countryside behind them, the great cloud shadow once more began its sailing. The brilliantly lit house stood out fantastically in the gloom. "Should have turned those out," Nookliff muttered, looking back. "Outlines us." The dogs strained at their leashes. In the black west was an inaudible muttering as of winter thunder. Brucey pointed a quivering nose at the woods and growled. "He's in there, all right." "We'd better step on it," Bennington said, whispering. "Going to be plenty dark in about 5 minutes. Storm." Still they hesitated, regarding the menacing darkness of the forest. Then Nookliff waved his gun hand in the conventional deploy a skirmisher's signal and plowed forward. The rest spread out in a loosely spaced line and followed, and Foot's finger trembled over his trigger. The forest in the shrouded darkness was a place of clutching brittle claws, contorted bodies, and the briefly glimpsed demon faces of ambushed horrors. It was Dante's jungle, the woods of purgatory, where each tree was a body frozen in agony and branches were gnarled arms and fingers which groaned in the wind or gave sharp, tiny, tinkling screams as they were broken off. The underbrush grasped at Foot's legs. His feet broke jarringly through the crust of snow or were supported by it when he least expected support. His shoulders struck unseen tree trunks. Imagined things sniffed frightfully at his heels or slunk about him just beyond his range of vision. The touch of a hand was enough to make him jump and smother an involuntary outcry. The dogs strained and panted, weaving, no longer snarling, silent with a vicious intentness. "They've picked up something, all right," Bennington whispered. "Turn 'em loose, Tom?" Nookliff bent and snapped the leashes free. Without a sound the animals shot ahead and disappeared. Over the forest the oncoming storm clouds crawled across the moon. Total blackness engulfed them. The beam of a powerful flashlight lanced from Nookliff's free hand, picking out a path of tracks on the brush-littered snow. The rest of the night drew in closer about the blue-white ray. "Hate to do this," Nookliff said. "It gives us away. But he knows we're— Hello, it's snowing." "Let's go then," Foot said. "The tracks will be blotted out shortly." A terrible clamorous baying rolled suddenly through the woods. "That's it!" Nookliff shouted. "Listen to them! Go get him, Brucey!" They crashed ahead. Foot's heart was beating wildly, his nerves at an impossible pitch. The belling cry of the dogs echoed all around him, filling the universe with noise. "They must have sighted him," he panted. "What a racket! They'll raise the whole countryside." They plowed blindly through the snow-filled woods. Then, without any interval, they stumbled into a small clearing. Snowflakes flocculated the air. Something dashed between Foot's legs, snapping savagely, and he tripped and fell into a drift. A voice shouted something indistinguishable. Foot's mouth was full of snow. He jerked his head up, and looked straight into the red rage-glowing eyes of the wolf. It was standing on the other side of the clearing, facing him, the dogs leaping about it, snapping furiously at its legs. It made no sound at all but crouched tiger fashion, its lips drawn back in a grinning travesty of Jarmuskowski's smile. It lashed at the dogs as they came closer. One of the dogs already lay writhing on the ground, a dark pool spreading from it, staining the snow. "Shoot, for heaven's sake!" somebody screamed. Nookliff clapped his rifle to his shoulder, then lowered it indecisively. "I can't," he said. The dogs are in the way. The heck with the dogs! James shouted. This is no fox hunt. Shoot, Tom, you're the only one of us that's clear. It was Foot who tired first. The rifle's flat crack echoed through the woods and snow puffed up in a little explosion by the wolf's left hind pad. A concerted groan arose from the party and Nookliff's voice thundered above it, ordering his dogs back. Bennington aimed with inexorable care. The werewolf did not wait. With a screaming snarl he burst through the ring of dogs and charged. Foot jumped in front of Doris, throwing one arm across his throat. The world dissolved into rolling, twisting pandemonium, tilled with screaming and shouting and the frantic hatred of dogs. The snow flew thick. Nookliff's flashlight rolled away and lay on the snow, regarding the treetops with an idiot stare. Then there was the sound of a heavy body moving swiftly away. The shouting died gradually. Anybody hurt? James' voice asked. There was a general chorus of Rios. Nookliff retrieved his flashlight and played it about, but the snowfall had reached blizzard proportions and the light showed nothing but shadows and cold confetti. He got away, Bennington said. And the snow will cover his tracks. Better call your dogs back, Tom. They're back, Nookliff said. When I call them off, they come off. He bent over the body of the injured animal, which was still twitching feebly. So, he said softly. So, Brucey. Easy. So, Brucey, still murmuring, he brought his rifle into position with one arm. Brucey. The rifle crashed. Nookliff arose and looked away. It looks as if we lose round one. It seemed to become daylight very quickly. The boer went phlegmatically around the house, snapping off the lights. If he knew what was going on, he gave no sign of it. Cappy? Nookliff said into the phone. Listen and get this straight, it's important. Send a cable to Consolidated Warfare Service. No, not the Zurich office. They've offices in London - and place an order for a case of .44 caliber rifle cartridges. So. Dog's tail beat feebly against the snow. Listen to me, damn it, I'm not through yet. With silver slugs. Yes, that's right, silver, and it had better be the pure stuff, too. No, not sterling, that's too hard. Tell them I want them flown over, and that they've got to arrive here tomorrow. Yes, I know it's impossible, but if you offer them enough, yes, of course I'll cover it. Got that? Garlic, Lundgren said to Caroline. She wrote it dutifully on her marketing list. How many windows does this place have? All right, make it 1 clove for each and get half a dozen boxes of rosemary, too. He turned to Foot. We must cover every angle, he said somberly. As soon as Tom gets off the phone, I'll try to raise the local priest and get him out here with a truckload of silver crucifixes. Understand, Paul, there is a strong physiological basis behind all the medieval mumbo-jumbo. The herbs are antispasmodies. They act rather as ephedrine does in hay fever to reduce the violence of the seizure. It's possible that Jan may not be able to maintain the wolf shape if he gets a good enough sniff. As for the religious trappings, that's all psychological. If Jan happens to be a skeptic in such matters, they won't bother him, but I suspect he's... Lundgren's English abruptly gave out. The word he wanted obviously was not in his vocabulary. Aberglubig, he said. Creandra. Superstitious? Foot suggested, smiling grimly. Yes. Yes, certainly. Who has better reason, may I ask? But how does he maintain the wolf shape at all? Oh, that's the easiest part. You know how water takes the shape of a vessel it sits in? Well, protoplasm is a liquid. This pineal hormone lowers the surface tension of the cells and at the same time short-circuits the sympathetic nervous system directly to the cerebral cortex. Result, a plastic, malleable body within limits. A wolf is easiest because the skeletons are similar, not much Pinnerin can do with bone, you see. An ape would be easier, but apes don't eat people. And vampires? Are they just advanced cases of the same thing? Vampires, said Lundgren pontifically, are people we put in padded cells. It's impossible to change the bony structure that much. They just think they're bats. But yes, it's advanced hyperpinealism. In the last stages it is quite something to see. The surface tension is lowered so much that the cells begin to boil away. Pretty soon there's just a mess. The process is arrested when the vascular system can no longer circulate the hormone, but of course the victim is dead long before that. No cure? None yet. Someday perhaps, but until then, we will be doing Jan a favor. Also, Nucliffe was saying, drive over and pick me up 6 Browning automatic rifles. Never mind the bipods, just the rifles themselves. What? Well, you might call it a siege. All right, Cappy. No, I won't be in today. Pay everybody off and send them home until further notice. It's a good thing, Foote said, that Nucliffe has money. It's a good thing, said Lundgren, that he has me and you. We'll see how 20th century methods can cope with this Dark Age disease. Nucliffe hung up and Lundgren took possession of the phone. As soon as my man gets back from the village, I'm going to set out traps. He may be able to detect hidden metal. I've known dogs that could do it by smell in wet weather, but it's worth a try. What's to prevent his just going away? Doris asked. Somehow the shadows of exhaustion and fear around her eyes made her lovelier than ever. As I understand it, he thinks he's bound by the pentagram, Foote said. At the telephone, where Lundgren evidently was listening to a different conversation with each ear, there was an energetic nod. In the old books, the figure is supposed to be a sure trap for demons and such if you can lure them into it. And the werewolf feels compelled to go only for the person whom he thinks is marked with it. Lundgren said, "Excuse me," and put his hand over the mouthpiece. "Only last 7 days," he said. "The compulsion? Then we'll have to get him before then." "Well, maybe we'll sleep tonight anyhow," Doris said dubiously. Lundgren hung up and rejoined them. "I didn't have much difficulty selling the good father the idea," he said. "But he only has crucifixes enough for our ground floor windows. By the way, he wants a picture of Jan in case he should turn up in the village. There are no existing photographs of Jarmuskowski," Nucliffe said positively. "He never allowed any to Beta-Ken. It was a headache to his concert manager." "That's understandable," Lundgren said. "With his cell radiogens under constant stimulation, any picture of him would turn out overexposed anyhow, probably a total blank. And that in turn would expose January." "Well, that's too bad, but it's not irreparable," Foote said. He was glad to be of some use again. He opened Nucliffe's desk and took out a sheet of stationery and a pencil. In 10 minutes he had produced a head of Jarmuskowski in 3/4 profile as he had seen him at the piano that last night so many centuries ago. Lundgren studied it. "To the life," he said. "I'll send this over by messenger." "You draw well, Paul." Bennington laughed. "You're not telling him anything he doesn't know," he said. Nevertheless, Foote thought, there was considerably less animosity in the critic's manner. "What now?" James asked. "We wait," Nucliffe said. "Bennington's gun was ruined by that one handmade slug. We can't afford to have our weapons taken out of action. If I know Consolidated they'll have the machine-made jobs here tomorrow. Then we'll have some hope of getting him. Right now he's shown us he's more than a match for us in open country." The group looked at each other. Some little understanding of what it would mean to wait through nervous days and tear-stalked nights, helpless and inactive, already showed on their faces. But there were necessities before which the demands of merely human feelings were forced to yield. The conference broke up in silence. For Foote, as Lord the rest, that night was instinct with dread, pregnant every instant with the terror of the outcry that the next moment might bring. The waning moon, greenish and sickly, reeled over the house through a sky troubled with fulgurous clouds. An insistent wind made distant wolf howls, shook from the trees soft sounds like the padding of stealthy paws, rattled windows with the scrape of claws trying for a hold. The atmosphere of the house, hot and stuffy because of the closed windows and reeking of garlic, was stretched to an impossible tautness with waiting. In the empty room next to Foote there was the imagined coming and going thin ghosts, and the crouched expectancy of a turned-down bed, awaiting an occupant who might depress the sheets in a shocking pattern, perhaps regardless of the tiny pitiful glint of the crucifix upon the pillow. Above him, other sleepers turned restlessly, or groaned and started up from chilling nightmares. The boundary between the real and the unreal had been let down in his mind, and in the flickering shadows of the moon and the dark errands of the ghosts there was no way of making any selection. He had entered the cobwebby blackness of the borderland between the human and the demon, where nothing is ever more than half true, or half untruth. After a while, on the threshold of this darkness, the blasphemous voices of the hidden evil things beyond it began to seep through. The wind, abandoning the trees and gables, whispered and echoed the voices, counting the victims slowly as death stalked through the house. 1. 2. 3, closer now. 4, the fourth sleeper struggled a little. Foote could hear a muffled creak of springs over his head. 5. 6, who was 6? Who is next? When? 7, oh Lord, I'm next. I'm next. I'm next. He curled into a ball, trembling. The wind died away and there was silence, tremendous silence. After a long while he uncurled, swearing at himself but not aloud, because he was afraid to hear his own voice. Cut that out, now. Foote, you bloody fool. You're like a kid hiding from the goblins. You're perfectly safe. Lundgren says so. Mama says so. How the heck does Lundgren know? He's an expert. He wrote a paper. Go ahead, be a kid. Remember your childhood faith in the printed word? All right then. Go to sleep, will you? There goes that damned counting again. But after a while his worn-down nerves would be denied no longer. He slept a little but fitfully, falling in his dreams through such deep pits of evil that he awoke fighting the covers and gasping for the vitiated garlic-heavy air. There was a fetid foulness in his mouth, and his heart pounded. He threw off the covers and sat up, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands and trying not to see the shadows the flame threw. He was no longer waiting for the night to end. He had forgotten that there ever was such a thing as daylight, was waiting only for the inevitable growl that would herald the last horror. Thus it was a shock almost beyond bearing to look out the window and see the brightening of dawn over the forest. After staring incredulously at it for a moment, he snubbed out his cigarette in the candlestick, which he had been carrying around the house as if it had grown to him, and collapsed. With a sigh he was instantly in deep and dreamless sleep. When he finally came to consciousness he was being shaken and Bennington's voice was in his ear. Get up, man, the critic was saying. No, you needn't reach for the candlestick, everything's okay thus far. Foote grinned. It's a pleasure to see a friendly expression on your face, Bennington, he said with a faint glow of general relief. Bennington looked a little abashed. I misjudged you, he admitted. I guess it takes a crisis to bring out what's really in a man so that blunt brains like mine can see it. You don't mind if I continue to dislike your latest abstractions, I trust? That's your function, Foote said cheerfully. To be a gadfly. Now what's happened? Nookliff got up early and made the rounds of the traps. We got a good-sized rabbit out of one of them and made a stew. Very good, you'll see. The other one was empty, but there was blood on it and on the snow. Lundgren isn't up yet, but we've saved scrapings for him. James poked his head around the door jamb, then came in. Hope it cripples him, he said, dexterously snaffling a cigarette from Foote's shirt pocket. Pardon me. All the servants have deserted us but the butler, and nobody will bring cigarettes up from the village. My, said Foote. Everyone feels so chipper. Boy, I never thought I'd be as glad to see any sunrise as I was today's. If you dash. There was a sound outside. It sounded like the world's biggest tea kettle. Something flitted through the sky, wheeled and came back. Cripes, Foote said, shading his eyes. A big jet job. What's he doing here? The plane circled silently, jets cut. It lost flying speed and glided in over the golf course, struck and rolled at breakneck speed straight for the forest. At the last minute the pilot spun to a stop expertly. By heaven, I'll bet that's Nookliff's bullets. They pounded downstairs. By the time they reached the front room the pilot was coming in with Nookliff. A heavy case was slung between them. Nookliff pried the case open. Then he sighed. Look at 'em, he said. Nice, shiny brass cartridges, and dull silver heads machined for perfect accuracy. Yum yum. I could just stand here and pet them. Where are you from? Croydon, said the pilot. If you don't mind, Mr. Nookliff, the company said I was to collect from you. That's £100 for the cartridges and 500 for me. Cheap enough. Hold on. I'll write you a check. Foote whistled. He didn't know whether to be more awed by the Trans-Atlantic Express service or the vast sum it had cost. The pilot took the check and shortly thereafter the tea kettle began to whistle again. From another huge wooden crate Nussieff was handing out brand new Brownings. Now let him come, he said grimly. Don't worry about wasting shots. There's a full case of clips. As soon as you see him, blaze away like mad. Use it like a hose if you have to. Somebody go wake Chris, Bennington said. He should have lessons too. Doris, go knock on his door like a good girl. Doris nodded and went upstairs. Now this stud here, Nussieff said, is the fire control button. You put it in this position and the gun will fire one shot and reload. Put it here and you have to reload it yourself like any rifle. Put it here and it goes into automatic operation, firing every shell in the clip, one after the other. Thunder! James said admiringly. We could stand off an army. Wait a minute, there seem to be 2 missing. Those are all you unpacked, Bennington said. Yes, but there were 2 older models of my own. I never used them because it didn't seem right to hunt with such a cannon. But I got 'em out last night on account of this trouble. Oh, Bennington said with an air of sudden enlightenment. I thought that thing I had looked odd. I slept with one last night. I think Lundgren has another. Where is Lundgren? Doris should have had him up by now. Go see Bennington and get that gun. Isn't there a lot of recoil? Foote asked. Sure. These are really meant to operate from bipods. Hold the gun at your hip, not your shoulder. What's that? Bennington's voice, Foote said, suddenly tense. Something must be wrong with Doris. The 4 of them clattered for the stairs. They found Doris at Bennington's feet in front of Lundgren's open door. Evidently she had fainted without a sound. The critic was in the process of being very sick. On Lundgren's bed lay a crimson horror. The throat was ripped out and the face and all the soft parts of the body had been eaten away. The right leg had been gnawed in one place all the way to the bone, which gleamed white and polished in the reassuring sunlight. Foote stood in the living room by the piano in the full glare of all the electric lights. He hefted the B.A.R. and surveyed the remainder of his companions, who were standing in a puzzled group before him. "No," he said. "I don't like that. One don't want you all bunched together. String out in a line, in front of me, so I can see everybody." He grinned briefly. "Got the drop on you, didn't I? Not a rifle in sight. Of course, there's the big candlestick behind you, Nucliffe, but I can shoot quicker than you can club me." His voice grew ugly. "And I will, if you make it necessary. So I would advise everybody, including the women, not to make any sudden moves." "What is this all about, Paul?" Bennington demanded angrily. "As if things aren't bad enough." "You'll see directly. Now line up the way I told you. Kayak!" He moved the gun suggestively. "And remember what I said about sudden moves. It may be dark outside, but I didn't turn on all the lights for nothing." Quietly the line formed and the eyes that looked at Foote were narrowed with suspicion of madness, or worse. "Good. Now we can talk comfortably. You see, after what happened to Chris, I'm not taking any chances. That was partly his fault and partly mine. But the gods allow no one to err twice in matters like this. He paid a ghastly price for his second error, a price I don't intend to pay or to see anyone else here pay. Would you honor us with an explanation of this error?" Nucliffe said icily. "Yes. I don't blame you for being angry, Tom, since I'm your guest. But you see, I'm forced to treat you all alike for the moment. I was fond of Lundgren." There was silence for a moment, then a thin indrawing of breath from Bennington. "You were fond, my lord," he whispered raggedly. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Lundgren was not killed by Jarmuskowski," Foote said coldly and deliberately. "He was killed by someone else. Another werewolf. One who is standing before me at this moment." A concerted gasp went up. "Surprised? But it's true. The error for which Chris paid so dearly, which I made too, was this: we forgot to examine everybody for injuries. After the encounter with January, we forgot one of the cardinal laws ot. Lycanthropy. A man who survives being bitten by a werewolf himself becomes a werewolf. That's how the disease is passed on. The pink heron in the saliva gets in the bloodstream, stimulates the victim's own pineal gland but nobody was bitten, Paul," Doris said in a reasonable voice. "Somebody was, Leidy. None of you but Chris and myself could know about the bite infection. Evidently somebody got a few small scratches, didn't think them worth mentioning, put iodine on them and forgot them, until it was too late." There were slow movements in the line, heads turning surreptitiously, eyes glancing nervously at persons to left and right. "Once the attack occurred," Foote said relentlessly, "Chris was the logical first victim. The expert, hence the most dangerous enemy. I wish I had thought of this before lunch. I might have seen which one of you was uninterested in his lunch. In any event, Chris safeguards against letting Jarmuskowski and also keep you from getting out. You won't leave this room ever again." He gritted his teeth and brought himself back into control. "All right," he said. "This is the showdown. Everybody hold up both hands in plain view." Almost instantly there was a ravening wolf in the room. Only Foote, who could see at a glance the order of the people in the line, knew who it was. The frightful tragedy of it struck him such a blow that the gun dropped nervelessly from his hands. He wept convulsively. The monster lunged for his throat like a reddish projectile. Nucliffe's hand darted back, grasped the candlestick. He leapt forward in a swift, cat-like motion and brought it down across the werewolf's side. Ribs burst with a horrible splintering sound. The beast spun, snarling with agony. Nucliffe hit it again across the backbone. It fell, screaming, fangs slashing the air. 3 times, with concentrated viciousness, Nucliffe struck at its head. Then it cried out once in an almost familiar voice, and died. Slowly the cells of its body groped back toward their natural positions. The awful crawling metamorphosis was never completed. But the hairy-haunched thing with the crushed skull which sprawled at Nucliffe's feet was recognizable. It had been Caroline Nucliffe. There was a frozen tableau of wax figures in the yellow lamplight. Tears coursed along Foot's palms, dropped from under them, fell silently to the carpet. After a while he dropped his hands. Bennington's face was gray with illness but rigidly expressionless like a granite statue. James' back was against the wall. He watched the anomalous corpse as if waiting for some new movement. As Lord Nucliffe he had no expression at all. He merely stood where he was, the bloody candlestick held loosely in a limp hand. His eyes were quite empty. After a moment Doris walked over to Nucliffe and touched his shoulder compassionately. The contact seemed to let something out of him. He shrank visibly into himself, shoulders slumping, his whole body withering visibly into a dry husk. The candlestick thumped against the floor, rocked wildly on its base, toppled across the body. As it struck Foot's cigarette butt, which had somehow remained in it all day, tumbled out and rolled crazily along the carpet. "Tom," Doris said softly. "Come away now. There's nothing you can do." "Blood," he said emptily. "She had a cut on her hand. Handled the scrapings from the trap, my trap. I did it. Just a bread knife cut from making canapes. I did it." "No, you didn't. Tom. Let's get some rest." She took his hand. He followed her obediently, stumbling a little as his blood-spattered shoes scuffed over the thick rug, his breath expelling from his lungs with a soft whisper. The two disappeared up the stairs. Bennington bolted for the kitchen sink. Foot sat down on the piano bench, his worn face taut with dried tears, and picked at the dusty keys. The lightly struck notes aroused James. He crossed the room and looked down at Foot. "You did well," the novelist said shakily. "Don't condemn yourself, Paul." Foot nodded. He felt nothing. Nothing at all. "The body?" "Yes. I suppose so." He got up from the bench. Together they carried the tragic corpse out through the house to the greenhouse. "We should leave her here," Foot said with a faint return of his old irony. "Here's where the wolfbane bloomed and started the whole business." "Poetic justice, I suppose," James said. "But I don't think it's wise. Tom has a tool shed at the other end that isn't steam heated. It should be cold enough." Gently they placed the body on the cement floor, laying some gunny sacks under it. "In the morning," Foot said, "we can have someone come for her." "How about legal trouble?" James said, frowning. "Here's a woman whose skull has been crushed with a blunt instrument. I think I can get Lundgren's priest to help us there," Foot said somberly. "They have some authority to make death certificates in this state. Besides, James, is that a woman? Inarguably it isn't Caroline." James looked sidewise at the hairy, contorted haunches. "Yes. Legally it's nothing. I see your point." Together they went back into the house. "Jarmuskowski?" James said. "Not tonight. We're all too tired and sick. And we do seem to be safe enough in here. Chris saw to that." Whatever James had to say in reply was lost in the roar of an automatic rifle somewhere over their heads, exhausting its shots in a quick stream. After a moment there was another burst of 10. Footsteps echoed. Then Bennington came bouncing down the stairs. "Watch out tonight," he panted. "He's around. I saw him come out of the woods in wolf form. I emptied the clip but missed and he went back again. I sprayed another 10 rounds around where T saw him going, but I don't think I hit him." "Where were you shooting from?" "The top of the tower." His face was very grim. "Went up for a last look around and there he was. I hope he comes tonight. I want to be the one who kills him." "How is Tom?" "Bad. Doesn't seem to know where he is or what he's doing." "Well, good night. Keep your eyes peeled." James nodded and followed him upstairs. Foot remained in the empty room a few minutes longer, looking thoughtfully at the splotch of blood on the priceless Persian carpet. Then he felt of his face and throat, looked at his hands, arms and legs, inside his shirt. Not so much as a scratch. Tom had seen that. So hard not to hate these afflicted people, so impossible to remember that lycanthropy was a disease like any other. Caroline, like the man in the red laugh, had been noble-hearted and gentle and had wished no one evil. Yet maybe God is on the side of the werewolves. The blasphemy of an exhausted mind. Yet he could not put it from him. Suppose Jarmuskowski should conquer his compulsion and lie out of sight until the 7 days were over. Then he could disappear. It was a big country. It would not be necessary for him to kill all his victims, just those he actually needed for food. But he could nip a good many. Every other one, say. And from wherever he lived the circle of lycanthropy would grow and widen and engulf. Maybe God had decided that proper humans had made a mess of running the world, had decided to give the Nosferatu, the undead, a chance at it. Perhaps the human race was on the threshold of that darkness into which he had looked throughout last night. He ground his teeth and made an exasperated noise. Shock and exhaustion would drive him as crazy as Nucliffe if he kept this up. He went around the room, making sure that all the windows were tightly closed and the crucifixes in place, turning out the lights as he went. The garlic was getting rancid. It smelled like mercaptan, but he was too tired to replace it. He clicked out the last light, picked up the candlestick and went out into the hall. As he passed Doris' room, he noticed that the door was ajar. Inside 2 voices murmured, remembering what he had heard before he stopped to eavesdrop. It was years later that Foot found out exactly what had happened at the very beginning. Doris, physically exhausted by the hideous events of the day, emotionally drained by tending the childlike Nucliffe, feeding him from a spoon and seeing him into bed, had fallen asleep almost immediately. It was a sleep dreamless except for a vague, dull undercurrent of despair. When the light tapping against the window panes finally reached her consciousness, she had no idea how long she had slumbered. She struggled to a sitting position and forced her eyelids up. Across the room the moonlight, gleaming in patches against the rotting snow outside, glared through the window. Silhouetted against it was a tall human figure. She could not see its face, but there was no mistaking the red glint of the eyes. She clutched for the rifle and brought it awkwardly into position. Jarmuskowski did not dodge. He moved his arms out a little way away from his body, palms forward in a gesture that looked almost supplicating, and waited. Indecisively she lowered the gun again. Was he inviting death? As she lowered the weapon she saw that the stud was in the continuous fire position, and carefully she shifted it to repeat. She was afraid of the recoil Nucliffe had mentioned, felt sure of her target if she could throw 1 shot at a time at it. Jarmuskowski tapped again and motioned with his finger. Reasoning that he would come in if he were able, she took time out to get into her housecoat. Then, holding her finger against the trigger, she went to the window. It was closed tightly and a crucifix, suspended from a silk thread, hung exactly in the center of it. She checked it, and then opened one of the small panes directly above Jarmuskowski's head. "Hello, Doris," he said softly. "Hello?" She was more uncertain than afraid. Was this actually happening or just a recurrent nightmare? What do you want? I should shoot you. Can you tell me why I shouldn't? Yes, I can. Otherwise, I wouldn't have risked exposing myself. That's a nasty-looking weapon. There are 10 silver bullets in it. I know it. I've seen Brownings before. I would be a good target for you too, so I have no hope of escape. My nostrils are full of rosemary. He smiled ruefully. And Lundgren and Caroline are dead, and I am responsible. I deserve to die. That is why I am here. You'll get your wish, Jan, she said. You have some other reason, I know. I will back my wits against yours. I want to ask you questions. Ask. You have your evening clothes on. Paul said they changed with you. How is that possible? But a wolf has clothes, Jarmuskowski said. He is not naked like a man. And surely Chris must have spoken of the effect of the pineal upon the cell radiogens. These little bodies act upon any organic matter, including wool or cotton. When I change, my clothes change with me. I can hardly say how, for it is in the blood, like musicianship. Either you can or you can't. But they change. His voice took on a darkly somber tone. Lundgren was right throughout. This werewolfery is now nothing but a disease. It is not pro-survival. Long ago there must have been a number of mutations which brought the pineal gland into use. None of them survived but the werewolves, and these are dying. Someday the pineal will come into better use and all men will be able to modify their forms without this terrible madness as a penalty. For us, the lycanthropes, the failures, nothing is left. There shall be no darkness. It is not good for a man to wander from country to country, knowing that he is a monster to his fellow men, and cursed eternally by his God, if he can claim a God. I went through Europe, playing the piano and giving pleasure, meeting people, making friends, and always, sooner or later, there were whisperings, and strange looks and dawning horror. And whether I was hunted down for the beast I was or whether there was merely a vague, gradually growing revulsion, they drove me out. Hatred, silver bullets, crucifixes, they are all the same in the end. Sometimes I could spend several months without incident in some one place and my life would take on a veneer of normality. I could attend to my music and have people about me that I liked and be human. Then the wolfbane bloomed and the pollen freighted the air, and when the moon shone down on that flower my blood surged with the thing one have within me. And then I made apologies to my friends and went north to Sweden, where Lundgren was and where spring was much later. I loved him and I think he missed the truth about me until night before last. I was careful. Once or twice I did not go north, and then the people who had been my friends would be hammering silver behind my back and waiting for me in dark corners. After years of this, 2 places in Europe would have me. With my reputation as a musician spread darker rumors. Towns I had never visited closed their gates to me without a word. Concert halls were booked up too many months in advance for me to use them. Inns and hotels were filled indefinitely. People were too busy to talk to me, to listen to my playing, to write me any letters. To have been in love. That I cannot describe. And then I came to this country. Here no one believes in the werewolf. I sought scientific help, not from Lundgren, because I was afraid I should do him some harm. But here I thought someone would know enough to deal with what I had become. It was not so. The primitive hatred of my kind lies at the heart of the human as it lies at the heart of the dog. There was no help for me. I am here to ask for an end to it. Slow tears rolled over Doris' cheeks. The voice faded away indefinitely. It did not seem to end at all, but rather to retreat into some limbo where men could not hear it. Jarmuskowski stood silently in the moonlight, his eyes burning bloodily, a somber sullen scarlet. Doris said, Jan, I am sorry, I am so sorry. What can I do? Shoot. I can't. Please, Doris. The girl was crying uncontrollably. Jan, don't. I can't. You know I can't. Go away, please go away. Jarmuskowski said. Then come with me, Doris. Open the window and come with me. Where? Does it matter? You have denied me the death I ask. Would you deny me this last desperate love? Would you deny your own love, your own last and deepest desire? It is too late now, too late for you to pretend revulsion. Come with me. He held out his hands. Say goodbye, he said. Goodbye to these self-righteous humans. I will give you of my blood and we will range the world, wild and uncontrollable, the last of our race. They will remember us, I promise you. Jan Dash. I am here. Come now. Like a somnambulist she swung the panes out. Jarmuskowski did not move but looked first at her, then at the crucifix. She lifted one end of the thread and let the little thing tinkle to the floor. After us there shall be no darkness comparable to our darkness, Jarmuskowski said. Let them rest, let the world rest. He sprang into the room with so sudden, so feral a motion that he seemed hardly to have moved at all. From the doorway the automatic rifle yammered with demoniac ferocity. The impact of the slugs hurled Jarmuskowski back against the wall. Foot lowered the smoking muzzle and took one step into the room. Too late, Jan, he said stonily. Doris wailed like a little girl awakened from a dream. Jarmuskowski's lips moved, but there was not enough left of his lungs. The effort to speak brought a bloody froth to his mouth. He paused for an instant, stretched out a hand toward the girl. Then the fingers clenched convulsively, and the long body folded. He smiled, put aside that last of all his purposes, and died. This is the end of the story. Tell us what you think in the comment section. Please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release new content. If you want to support us, consider joining our channel membership. You will get instant early access to more than 100 stories before their release. This is the only way to support our channel.